Now, you could say that my first guest today, Aunma Oteh, is a real mover and shaker in the financial industry. At a time when the prevailing stereotype of who works in the world of finance tends to be that of a charging, swashbuckling man embracing risk, Aunma Oteh couldn't be further from that cliche, to quote one broadcaster. Yet she's become a globally recognized female leader in finance, playing a crucial role in transforming the markets for the better and in the process empowering men and women in Nigeria, across Africa and around the world. With a professional record that includes Vice President and Treasurer of the World Bank, nearly 2 decades at the African Development Bank, and a lauded tenure as Director General of Nigeria's Security and Exchange Commission, you couldn't get a more stellar CV than that. But now she's become an academic scholar at Oxford University and the new chair at the Royal African Society in the UK, and is increasingly turning her attention to the disruption caused by climate change to the economies, security and demographic patterns in Africa. And I'm absolutely enraptured beyond measure to say that Aunma Oteh joins me now in the studio. Thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Oh, thank you very much.
You made it. Congratulations.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
But thank you so much for such a phenomenal introduction. I'm
Yeah,
worrying about whether I should
are.
say thank you or whether you're setting me up for people having much higher expectations.
No. That's who you are.
Yes.
Every bit of it is 100% accurate. Actually, we're concerned that we weren't giving enough accolade because, I mean, it is a very deserving thing. But
maybe I can just also say that you're a phenomenal anchor, and it's an honor to be sitting across from you.
Well,
in the Arise TV studio.
Thank you. But let's start a mutual admiration club.
Done.
You
Done.
can drop in and I'll drop in.
We have a deal.
But let's start by having you take us back when you started up the career ladder in the financial industry, because that will help us understand how you reached the heights that you've attained. I mean, how did it all start for you along the road to this great bastion of influence where you ended up?
You're really kind. do you want a day? Because mine is really unusual.
Well, let's hear it.
Well, some who've heard me talk about it, it really started at home with my parents at the dinner table. So I had parents who were public servants. My father was an engineer, my mother was a nurse. And to complement their income, they invested in the Nigerian stock market. Mm-hmm. And my dad, for those who know my dad will understand this, after dinner, my siblings and I took turns to read the annual reports of the companies that they had invested in.
And how old were you then?
I was 8,
Good God.
that I remember. And I remember being a bit rebellious about, after dinner, reading these very technical...
Very boring.
Yes.
For an 8-year-old.
That's what I thought at the time.
Yeah.
My father being an engineer, he tried to get my 2 older sisters to become engineers, and they didn't become engineers, so I was the next target. And so when it was time to think about careers, he automatically assumed that I would become an engineer. I was in boarding school here in Nigeria at one of the Unity colleges, the Federal Government Girls College, Owerri. And that's another early foundation that was phenomenal in who I've become. So I went to the career counselor. We had career counselors at the time in my final year in secondary school. And I said, I have a secret to share with you, which please, my parents can't hear about this. My mother wants me to be a medical doctor. My father wants me to be an engineer. I don't want to be near a hospital because it's just, it's very emotional for me. Even when I've gone to spend time and wait for my mother, it's just been difficult. An engineer, my father lived his life by engineering principles. Everything was straight and square, and I just really wanted a little flexibility in my life. And he says, okay, well, let's talk about what you'd like to do. And I said,
I'd like to count money.
No, I didn't even say that at the time. I didn't actually say that at the time. I said I wanted to be an inventor. And she's like, an inventor? I said, yes, of something scientific. I loved Albert Einstein, Isaac Newton, and I really wanted to change the world in that way. And she's like, okay, you're obviously very good in science, but let's think about what you could do. So we went through all various careers, and she talked about computer science. And I thought, this is new, this is modern. I mean, this is 1979. And I thought that's what I would do. And got a first degree in computer science. My parents thought I should just go and do a PhD. She loves to read, she's very intellectual. But I'm always somebody who wanted some independence. So I thought, I'd search for a job. And what's great about Nigeria is that you always have, people say a village. I mean, you have an entire country that's rooting for you. So while my parents had a desire of what they wanted me to do, I had a sense that I wanted to just be independent of them, and so wanted to go find a job. So I had uncles and cousins who helped me, and I got my first job at Centerpoint Investments Limited. Doesn't exist today, but the founder, late Chief Dennis Oteh, is a doyen of finance. I mean, he's a doyen of the capital markets, and was hired to be in the information technology team. But he thought I would do well in corporate finance, and that's really where it started. I cut the bug, and the rest, I say, is history.
Well, I was going to say that it sounds like you could have done well, because I mean, you did very well in school. Let's face it. I mean, you could have done well in anything you chose to do.
Well, I don't know. There are things I've been. I was one of those who was very fortunate. We had a tennis player, I can't remember her name, who was very popular, who came to Kano and trained some young girls. I don't play tennis today,
Okay,
so I'm a failed tennis player. I'm a failed musician. I love the guitar, I love the piano. My sisters play the organ very well. So there are things that I don't do well.
Well, we're glad you took the line that you took, because your contribution in that respect has been absolutely enormous. And you've worked with all these global organizations, and at the very top of the financial world as an African. You've attended very impressive universities. You've got all these qualifications. Is there still a grudging recognition of Africa's political and economic importance in the scheme of global things?
Well, I think that we've made significant progress, and today most people recognize that where Africa goes is where the world goes. You've got it's the most youthful continent in the world. I think 60% or more of Africans are younger than 25 years old. Some people think it's 70% even. So that's one. So the future of the workforce, the future of society is Africa. If you even go back to the past, a lot of the things that have powered nations around the world, the natural resources have come from Africa. Some of the things that will power nations in the future, electric vehicles, cobalt is dependent on cobalt, our devices, our personal devices, same thing. So there is that recognition. There is also the recognition that there needs to be greater leadership on the political side, and that, from my perspective, the capital markets need to be much deeper, so that you can have domestic capital be able to support the economic prosperity of the continent. So there is a recognition of the challenges, but there is a recognition of the opportunities. But I would say that, in a sense, I think we had reached a period of excitement when you had everybody writing about, Africa rising. And right now, because of the global challenges, because of some of the challenges in Africa, we're not seeing that excitement. But that excitement needs to be there. I mean, if you see what's happening in the technology space, if you see some of the unicorns that are coming out of Nigeria, out of Kenya, out of South Africa, out of Morocco, out of Tunisia, then you see that the possibilities are still there.
But it needs to be aggregated properly, doesn't it? I mean, you mentioned Africa Rising. Arise News got its name from that. Arise means Africa Rising. Okay. But I mean, you mentioned the challenges. There is, I mean, beyond all the other development issues. I mean, there's, corruption, there's all kinds of things. And when you were head of Nigeria's Security and Exchange Commission, you took many powerful people to task over corruption and fraud, and you faced a ferocious backlash. How difficult was that period for you? Because you had public support, didn't you?
Oh, absolutely, and it's interesting that you share that. People just want people to do the right thing. Most Nigerians want public servants to deliver, I was even more fascinated about the support that I got through the process. I mean, people want to educate their children. They want to eat 3 square meals. They want health care. They want to, after they've retired, to enjoy their pension. And so if people feel that you're doing the right thing as a public servant, they will support you. That was my experience. But what happened in the 5 years that I was Director General SEC is not unusual. It happens everywhere in the world. People who are profiting from the status quo will want the status quo.
They resist,
yes.
basically.
So if you bring change, people will wonder whether they can stop that change from occurring. And so what we need is public servants that are courageous, but more importantly, that have empathy, that care about delivering for the average person, because public servants are called servants for a purpose. They're servants to the people.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely. And rightly or wrongly, you got a nickname from that. I don't know if it was exactly from that period, but they started calling you the Iron Lady. Was that a moniker that you welcomed? And did you get that when you were DG of the SEC?
I got it when I was DG of the SEC, not before then.
Right.
It was fine with me because I thought the connotation of Iron Lady meant somebody who was courageous, somebody who had strength, and I've been asked that before. So it's a name that I have no problem being called. If it helps people understand what I'm trying to achieve, and if it helps people
basically don't cross the line,
a line around me. I mean, there were people who said I was a new sheriff in town. I was like, okay, I mean, that's good too.
Give me a big cowboy hat. But you've had now years of experience, as I mentioned, in leadership positions in the capital markets, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the Nigerian Securities and Exchange Commission. Are you done with that world of finance now? Because you've turned to advocacy and the Royal African Society.
You're never done with a finance career. I mean, my view, we had a big financial literacy agenda in Nigeria when I was here, is that every human being needs to manage their finances, and you can do it for yourself or do it for your family or do it for society. I did decide that I would have a more portfolio-oriented career first because I started my career as an academic. My first job was teaching at the University of Benin. I loved it. I like young people. I like influencing young people early in their lives. The University of Oxford has always been a dream for me, and every point in time.
Well, you're there now.
Yes, so I made the decision to seek the opportunity that I have in University of Oxford. But the opportunity. So in this phase of my life, what I'm thinking about is how can I influence society the most, and that's what kind of guides my decision to become an academic. But also guides my decision to, when afforded the opportunity, to join the Royal African Society as the chairperson. I mean, this is a 120-year-old institution.
Well, I was just going to say it's a hugely respected organization. Yes. I have to say I've had a lot of contact with the Royal African Society. Yes. I've learned a lot. I've followed the progress of the society. 120 years since it was founded in 1901. That's more than a century of setting the context for some of the important issues facing African people and their relationship with the rest of the world. Is that what attracted you?
Oh, it's much more. But I'm so delighted as to the fact that you're familiar with the Royal African Society. I have colleagues who are phenomenal. our director, Dr.
Nicholas Westcott. Yeah, he's been on this show. Brilliant.
I mean, he
brilliant
loves
guy.
Africa.
Yeah.
He knows Africa.
Absolutely.
And he's an Africanist. Our deputy director, Mr. Haley, is similarly someone who knows Africa and loves Africa. But there's a lot that the Royal African Society does.
Right.
So maybe I can start at the beginning
Okay.
and share with you because.
Right. Well, just bear in mind that we have to take a break in about a minute and a half. But I was going to ask you to tell us about the latest advocacy on behalf of Africa, because the world is preparing for COP26, that climate conference in Glasgow, and that's something that's very important to you, isn't it?
So do you have a day for our conversation?
Sadly not.
But
a few hours.
But I did want to say that I am absolutely honored to be the chairperson of the Royal African Society. Zainab Badawi is my predecessor, and in the last 7 years, she's created a fascinating organization.
She did well.
Her predecessor was Lord Mark Malloch Brown.
Yeah.
So these are
I know
people
Mark
who
Malloch Brown
care for
Yeah.
society, and as you know, Mark is now the president of the Open Society Foundations. But the starting point is, what was the reason that the Royal African Society was set up? And I'd like to just share a few thoughts around
I may
that.
have to interrupt you.
That's fine.
But you'll come back and finish, because we've got to take a break.
That's fine. So do you want to take the break now, or should I just go on?
No, we have to take a break at a particular time. So let's do it now. So please stay with us. No, what I mean is, let's take a break now. And then we shall return so that I don't interrupt you. So let's take the break.
That's fine.
Stay with us. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with the former Vice President and Treasurer of the World Bank and former DG of the Nigerian Securities and Exchange Commission, Aunma Oteh. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Enyegolu. Now, my first guest today is the former Vice President and Treasurer of the World Bank, Aunma Oteh, who worked for 17 years at the African Development Bank and was the Director General of the Nigerian Securities and Exchange Commission. But now she's become the new chair at the international Africa-focused, UK-based organization, the Royal African Society, which until recently had the Queen as its patron, but who's now been replaced by Prince William. Recently, the Royal African Society held a climate and conflict conference looking at how Africa's economies, security, and demographic patterns have been disrupted by climate change, even though the continent is least responsible for the damage caused by the production of carbon emissions. It is this threat from climate change to Africa that Ms. Oteh is increasingly turning her attention to, searching for solutions, along with the Royal African Society, to the growing problem of global warming as it affects the continent. And the new chair of the Royal African Society, Aunma Oteh, is still with me in the studio. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. How do you see your new role as chair of the Royal African Society in the organization's broader representation of Africa?
Well, first and foremost, I really just want to say that at every point in my life, I ask myself what would be my legacy? And in this phase of my life, I really just want to have impact on society. And the Royal African Society allows me, along with my colleagues, council members, and the team led by Dr. Nick Westcott, to do that, just so I can share with you the variety of ways in which we influence society. So starting on the 5th of October for the next 2 weeks, we have our biennial Africa Rights Festival. And earlier in the year, Abdul Razak Gunnar, who was recently awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, spent time with us. So one of the things that we like is that we do have the opportunity to interact and showcase African writers that have unique genre and can make a difference. And so there's an online one that's going on right now, and then there's an in-person event on the 23rd and on the 24th. So that's Africa Rights. Next year we'll have our Film Africa in partnership with the British Film Institute, similarly promoting Africa Film. We are the Secretariat of the All Parties Parliamentary Group for Africa, which has 200 members and is chaired by Right Honorable Chi Onwura, who many of us know because she's visited this country and a number of other countries, advocating partnership between the UK and the continent of Africa. We have the platform that is very well known around the world, the Africa Arguments platform, that has about 1.5 million readers. We organize business breakfasts for businesses in Africa who are looking to create a greater understanding of their businesses around the world. We do economic briefs. We make sure that we focus on the issues that are important. And so what's unique about the Royal African Society is that mix of arts, culture, politics, business, and bringing all that together. But most importantly, bringing together those who care about Africa, Africanists, Africans in the diaspora together. And I love our tagline: to connect, to learn, to debate, and to celebrate.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned all that, because there's always been a question mark over how much influence the Royal African Society exerts today on a post-colonial generation. I mean, questions have always been raised about how influential is it today? Because, I mean, it was there in the old sort of days.
It's for me, to react to what you've said, it's a mix of two things. So we have in our DNA what was the origin of the Royal African Society. So it was founded in memory of Mary Kingsley, who was a nurse, a scientific writer, an explorer, and who basically said that she traveled around Africa to learn about Africa, to give voice to Africa. And so over the years, we've changed to adapt to the current circumstances. So we have a very youthful audience across board. We also have membership from academia. We have membership that are students. One of the areas that I forgot to talk about is that we have a biennial conference, which is the conference that we partner with the African Studies universities in the UK to present. So students, academics, those who care about Africa come to that. We focus on the issues that are extremely important, which is why the focus on climate, security and demography was something that we put together today. So, it's a mix of what is in our DNA, but it's also who we are today. Who are those who care about Africa?
So very contemporary in a sense. So let me talk about the issues of the day. One of them, of course, as you mentioned, climate change. A big issue here is Africa receiving less per capita funding for adaptation to climate change than any other developing region in the world. Is that something that you're working on to change? Is that part of the advocacy?
Well, I think that the advocacy is much bigger than that.
Right, but in that specific instance.
Absolutely, because without finance, we're not going to make progress on a net zero target by 2050, whether globally or in Africa. And so the starting point is for us as Africans, for those who care about Africa, for those who care about climate issues, to ensure that Africa is at the front seat, represented. And so one of the things that we did on the 14th of September, we were very delighted that the Vice President of Nigeria anchored our event on climate, security and demography, because we know that there is a link between those three issues. And of course, it was we had as partners the International Crisis Group and the Africa Confidential. Our goal was to start to have Africans, individuals, to have corporates, to have sovereign nations understand that Africa has to have its own narrative.
Right.
But that narrative is a just transition.
Yeah, but it's difficult to have that narrative when you're always going to people cup in hand or cap in hand. Because, I mean, you've worked with all the big international organizations, the World Bank, the African Development. I mean, you know, I wonder, you must be in a very unique position to understand how Africa is often perceived in these international circles, because at every stage, I mean, I would imagine that it limits what the capacity to be on that front seat.
Oh, absolutely
when
not.
You don't have the resources to support what you're
doing.
doing.
Absolutely not. I think that everybody who understands the climate issues and the challenges of climate issues understands that everybody is in the same boat. I mean, this is not a boat where some people will sink and others won't sink. So where everybody needs to be aligned on how we move forward on this. And that's what is the beauty, in my view, of the efforts that have been made.
Yeah, but we're seeing the same thing with the pandemic, aren't we? Everybody is in the same boat, but, you know, some people are hoarding the vaccines for themselves.
Well, you're right about vaccine nationalism, and people have coined the word climate nationalism. But I'd like to go back to the point that those who do nationalism do not understand that where one goes is where everybody goes. If you don't have a just transition, it's going to impact everybody, because climate issues impact security, they impact migration, they impact demography. So people will see people migrating to their front doorsteps if they have not taken account of the issues in
right.
But the more important point for me is that I want Africa to shape the narrative. You know, people are not going to be dying while we're trying to protect the climate in 2100. So what we need is a just transition. What we need is a process that aligns development with issues of climate. So as you're thinking about addressing climate issues, you're also thinking about addressing the energy poverty. 70% of those who have no access at all to electricity live on this continent. Yet, you've got solar, you've got wind, you've got geothermal, you've got, of course, the fossil fuels. So whatever is done must be done thinking about how to get people out of poverty.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And by the way, you know, I was fascinated to learn that 80% of the consumption of energy is in Nigeria, is in cooking. And cooking is still done through charcoal and kerosene.
Firewood and all of that.
Yet, if we have these people transition to gas, we would not only move them further so that they can have a good life, but also will reduce the number of people who are dying from pollution. 10 million people die from pollution every year in the world. So there are many aspects of it. And what I'd like to see is people thinking through the issues in a manner that helps everybody have a common understanding. But the financing is important. And in 2009, I think it was the COP in one of the Nordic countries, in Copenhagen, there was an agreement that from 2020, that developing countries will get $100 billion every year to address issues of climate. That hasn't happened. And fortunately, the OECD produced a report to share that. The US government, President Biden at the recent UN General Assembly committed to doubling their own contribution. The UK is thinking of doing the same thing. So the rich nations need to make sure that they honor a promise that was made in 2009 in terms of financing.
What solutions did the Royal African Society Conference come up with? And how is all that likely to shape decisions at COP26? Is Africa going to be speaking with a collective voice for action at COP26?
Oh, I expect that Africans have to speak with a common voice, and I believe that our conference in September did help.
You made recommendations.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Right. So the first one is, of course, what I shared, which is a just transition, recognizing that the connections between issues of climate, issues of security, and issues of demography. The other is, of course, that preparation is absolutely key. And there is COP26 in Glasgow, but the next COP is in Africa. And so thinking through what does that mean and having a common view. One was making sure that we address the financing issues. You're not going to ask people to move away from fossil fuels without providing them the support that helps with investing in renewables, for example. So what we're seeing is that there's not enough funding that's coming out for clean energy sources, and there's funding being taken away from the fossil fuel sector. The other thing, which is very significant for me, is that gas is key. That you have to have a transition fuel between now and 2050. You're not going to have...
Well, that's what Nigeria is trying to do, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. I think Nigeria has articulated that very clearly. But I think across the continent, that's the common view, that you have to make sure that there's a transition fuel, because you're not turning off the switch from one minute to the other.
Absolutely.
And that gas is cleaner and provides that pathway to net zero.
Well,
but I think there's an agreement that net zero by 2050 is the way to go. Yeah.
We're going to be watching that very closely. I could talk with you forever.
Absolutely.
Sadly, we're out of time. But Aunma Oteh, the new chair of the Royal African Society, amongst the many hats that you've worn in the past, absolutely delighted to have had you here. Thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Thank you, Charles, for this opportunity.
Thank you very much.